There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to a house where something has gone wrong. It is not the silence of an empty house. An empty house has a specific quality to it, the neutral quiet of furniture and dust and undisturbed air. This silence is different. It is heavier. It carries weight that ordinary silence does not carry. And if you have spent enough time around it, you learn to recognize the difference. Deborah Zaraski had lived on the same estate as the Mochrie family in Bury, South Wales, for years. She was Catherine Mochrie's closest friend. She knew the rhythms of that household the way you know the rhythms of your neighbors when you have lived alongside them for a long time. The children coming and going. The sounds of a busy family moving through a busy house. A 10-year-old girl playing in the street. A dog being walked. The ordinary, unremarkable sounds of a life being lived. The house in Rutland Close had been silent for over 10 days. She had noticed it building, first a day, then 2, then a week. She told herself there were explanations. A holiday, a family trip, something ordinary. But Catherine Mochrie was her best friend. Catherine would have told her. Catherine always told her everything.
That Kath meant to me as a friend is impossible. We saw each other practically every day. If we didn't see each other, we spoke on the phone. I know, I don't just believe, I know that if there had been any problems to the marriage, she would have told me.
Then she noticed the smell and the flies. She called the police. Officers arrived at the Mochrie house on the evening of Sunday, July 23rd, 2000. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Nothing. They obtained a ladder, positioned it against the wall of the house, and an officer climbed to an upstairs bedroom window and looked inside. What he saw ended any possibility of an ordinary explanation. The lead detective on the case, Kevin O'Neill, was driving into work from Merthyr when the call came through. He was at the Fiddler Elbow roundabout when the officer at the scene described what had been found. O'Neill asked whether there was any sign of a break-in. The officer told him there was none. No forced entry anywhere. The house was locked from inside. O'Neill knew immediately who had done it. What he could not tell, what he would spend months trying and ultimately fail to establish with certainty, was why. To this day, no definitive explanation exists for what Robert Mochrie did on the night of July 12, 2000.
There were no alarm bells. There was nothing that alerted any of us to the fact that they were in such serious trouble.
There was no note, no letter, no final communication of any kind, no confession, no moment of public breakdown, no documented crisis that any person who knew him had witnessed. Just a house in Bury, South Wales, where 6 people had been and then were not. This is one of the most haunting and least discussed family annihilation cases in British criminal history. And the question it raises, the one it refuses to answer, is perhaps the most disturbing question true crime ever asks. What happens when there is no explanation? Bury is a seaside town in the Vale of Glamorgan, South Wales, sitting on the coast southwest of Cardiff. It is a working and middle-class community, not wealthy, not deprived, with a strong sense of local identity. People who grow up in Bury tend to stay in Bury. It is a place where families put down roots and where, for better and worse, everyone has some sense of everyone else's business. The Mochrie family had lived in the 5-bedroom detached house on Rutland Close for approximately 15 years. In that time, they had become a fixture of the estate, familiar, unremarkable, respected. The house itself was valued at around £250,000, comfortable by the standards of the area. A family home in the truest sense. Bedrooms for 4 children. A garden. Space for a dog. Robert Mochrie was 49 years old. He had spent his career as a civil servant until, around 5 years before the murders, he had left that secure employment to operate several licensed premises, pubs, in the Bury area. The transition from public sector employee to small businessman was one that many people make, and many find more difficult than they anticipated. The licensed trade is precarious. Hours are long. Margins are thin. Competition is constant. Whether Robert Mochrie was experiencing serious financial difficulty in the period before July 2000 was something investigators examined. But the evidence they found did not point to a crisis so severe that it alone explained what happened. His wife was Catherine Mochrie, known to friends as Kath. She was 45 years old and had been married to Robert for 23 years. She was a housewife, managing the home and raising the children. She was the older sister of Terry Holmes, a former Welsh and British Lions international rugby player, a genuinely celebrated figure in Welsh sporting culture. By the accounts of everyone who knew her, Kath was warm, social, and completely devoted to her children. Her best friend Deborah said, on camera, in the Channel 4 documentary made 3 years after the murders, that she did not just believe, but knew that if there had been any serious problems within the marriage, Kath would have told her. The 4 children spanned almost a decade of the family's life together. James was 18, on the edge of adulthood, the eldest. Sion was 16. Luke was 14, attending St. Richard Gwyn Catholic High School in Barry alongside his sister. Bethan was 10, the youngest, still at primary school, the child who used to play in the street outside the house on summer evenings, the child whose dog would need to be walked. The family were practicing Catholics. They attended Massachusetts. They were part of their community in the visible, genuine way of families who believe in community. Mike Clinch, the head teacher at St. Richard Gwyn, would say afterwards that he had seen Robert Mochrie at parents' evenings, that he had asked the right questions, that he had been quiet, calm, and softly spoken, that he had appeared, in every way, to be exactly the kind of father you hoped your pupils had. He said he could not understand why it had happened. Neither could anyone else. Detective Kevin O'Neill led the investigation into the deaths of the Mochrie family with the thoroughness that a case of this magnitude demanded. Police examined the family's finances in detail. Robert Mochrie's licensed premises had not been generating the income that a family of 6 required. There were financial pressures, but investigators did not find evidence of an imminent catastrophe. No bankruptcy filing, no creditor action about to materialize, no debt of such severity that it represented an obvious and immediate trigger. They spoke to everyone who had known the family. Friends, neighbors, business associates, school staff, church community members. The portrait that emerged was consistent across every source. A quiet man, a devoted family, no visible signs of the kind of fracture that produces this outcome. Not a single person who knew Robert Mochrie described any behavior in the weeks or months before the murders that they now identified, in retrospect, as a warning. What investigators did establish was that Robert Mochrie had been suffering from severe depression. This was documented. It was clinical. It was the clearest single factor that the investigation produced, and it is the closest thing to an explanation that this case has ever offered. Depression of the kind that family annihilators typically experience before these events is not the ordinary low mood of a person going through a difficult period. It is a total collapse of the capacity to perceive alternatives, a state in which the future has closed entirely, in which the suffering of the person has become, in their mind, indistinguishable from the suffering of everyone connected to them. But even this framework, the psychology of family annihilation, the documented pattern of men who kill their families in a specific profile of depressive collapse, requires something more to be present. A precipitating event, a moment of crisis, a point at which the collapse became complete. Robert Mochrie left no record of what that moment was. The night of July 12, 2000. What investigators were able to establish about the night of the murders was limited by the absence of any surviving witness. On the night of July 12, 2000, a Wednesday in the middle of a British summer, Robert Mochrie moved through the house on Rutland Close in darkness and killed his wife and 4 children. The method was blunt force trauma. He went from room to room. The bodies of his family were found in the upstairs bedrooms, which indicated that most or all of them had been attacked in their sleep or while in their rooms. Catherine, James, Sion, Luke, Bethan. Afterwards, and this is the detail that investigators found among the most difficult to process, Robert Mochrie spent approximately the next 24 hours conducting what can only be described as the ordinary administration of a household. He canceled Bethan's scheduled lifts to school. He wrote a note for the milkman, no milk until Friday, and left it where the milkman would find it. He put the family cat and dog outside. He cleaned the blood from the areas of the house where it had fallen. Not to conceal the crime, investigators established, because he clearly had no intention of concealing it and no plan to escape its consequences. He cleaned simply because cleaning was what you did. Then he went to the landing. He hanged himself. The family were not discovered for 10 to 11 days. When officers entered the house in Rutland Close on the evening of July 23rd, the scene they encountered was one that the most experienced among them described as unlike anything they had previously dealt with. 6 bodies in a single-family home. A father hanging on the landing. A family in their beds. A house that was, in its physical details, otherwise entirely ordinary. The dishes. The furniture. The family photographs on the walls. The evidence of a normal life stopped without warning in the middle of its own continuation. The family had been dead for 10 to 11 days in the summer heat. Deborah Zaraski, who had grown increasingly alarmed by the silence, had noticed the smell 2 or 3 days before she called police. She had told herself there were explanations. A blocked drain, something in the bins, the smell of a summer that was particularly warm. Then the flies. Then the call. Terry Holmes, Catherine's brother, the rugby international, a man whose public life had been built on physical strength and sporting achievement. Lost his sister, his brother-in-law, and 4 nieces and nephews in a single summer week. He has spoken publicly over the years about the devastation, about the impossibility of processing a loss that had no explanation attached to it. Grief is difficult enough when you understand what happened. Grief without explanation is something different entirely. The house on Rutland Close sat empty for some time after the murders. It was eventually renovated. Catherine's brother oversaw the work himself, redoing it from top to bottom, and sold. The new owners, who bought it at a significant discount to market value, were furious when Channel 4's production team approached them 3 years later to film a documentary about the case. They had been trying to put the tragedy behind them. The neighborhood had been trying to move on, but the case was not the kind that allowed people to move on easily, because the question at its center had never been answered. And unanswered questions do not rest quietly. The Channel 4 documentary Behind Closed Doors, broadcast in July 2003, was one of the most serious attempts to understand what had happened in Barry 3 years earlier. Its producer, Sue Bourne, said at the time that family mass murders were occurring in Britain at a rate of 1 every 6 to 8 weeks, a statistic that most people found both shocking and difficult to accept. The documentary examined the documented pattern of family annihilators, a term that criminologists and psychologists use to describe a specific profile of perpetrator. The research is consistent across multiple studies in multiple countries. Family annihilators are almost always male. They're almost always the primary financial provider or the person who most strongly identifies with that role. They experience a catastrophic collapse, financial, professional, relational, that they are psychologically unable to process, communicate, or survive. And in their collapse, they make a decision that is, from within their distorted perception, a form of protection. They will not leave their family to face the consequences of their failure alone. The annihilator does not perceive himself as a killer. He perceives himself as a man who has made an impossible decision in impossible circumstances. The literature on this pattern is extensive. The profile fits Robert Mochrie in most respects. The financial pressure, the depression, the family identity, the Catholic faith that may have intensified the shame attached to failure. But the profile also requires something that the Mochrie case does not clearly provide: a visible trigger, a specific event that pushed a deteriorating man from passive suffering into fatal action. Investigators looked for it. They did not find it. Or if it existed only inside the house on Rutland Close on the night of July 12, 2000, and died there with a man who could have explained it. There is a particular cruelty in a case like this that goes beyond the deaths themselves. When someone is killed and an explanation exists, however terrible, however inadequate, the people left behind can at least build something around it. A narrative, a sequence of events, a framework within which the grief can find some kind of shape. It is never enough, but it is something. The Mochrie case gave the people left behind nothing. Deborah Zaraski, who found the courage to call the police when her instinct told her something was catastrophically wrong, has lived with that discovery for over 20 years.
His friends saw what he'd done as an act of protection, a misguided act of love. If he'd only killed himself, then he would have been missed so much, and there would have been so much grief at his death. But the fact that he took Kath and the kids with him, I felt confused. I felt great sadness for him.
She has spoken about it publicly with a composure that is, in itself, a remarkable thing to witness. She knows she did the right thing. She also knows that what she found when she made that call has never fully released her. The children's school community, St. Richard Gwynn Catholic High School, grieved for Luke and Sion in the specific, acute way of school communities, where the absence of familiar faces is felt in every corridor and every classroom. Their friends have grown up now. They are adults. The people who sat beside Luke and Sion in class are in their 30s and 40s. Terry Holmes lost his sister. He lost 4 children he had watched grow up. He lost the man his sister had chosen and loved for 23 years. And he was given no reason. Not a word. Not a line. Nothing. Robert Mochrie's case sits in a category that most true crime struggles to accommodate. There is no resolution. No explanation that satisfies. No framework that fully contains what happened on the night of July 12, 2000, in a house on a quiet residential estate in Bury, South Wales. Criminal psychologists can offer a profile. Investigators can describe what they found and what they looked for. A documentary can ask questions and interview the people who were closest to the family. But the answer, the actual, complete answer to the question of why, does not exist anywhere that any of us can reach it. And that is the specific horror of this case. Most crimes, however terrible, allow us to trace a line. We can say, this person experienced this. They responded in this way. The outcome was this. The line is hideous. But is a line? Robert Mochrie left no line. He left only the outcome. And the outcome was Catherine, 45 years old, married for 23 years, her brother's older sister, her best friend's confidant. James, 18, on the edge of everything adulthood was supposed to bring him. Sion, 16. Luke, 14. Bethan, 10, who used to play in the street on summer evenings, whose dog was put outside before her father hanged himself on the landing. 5 people who deserved more than to be the ending of a story that has no beginning anyone can find. The house has new occupants now. The street looks ordinary. The school carries on. Bury carries on, the way communities always carry on, because there is no alternative to carrying on. But this case does not carry on. It sits where it has always sat, unresolved, unexplained, and deeply, permanently disturbing. Because the most frightening thing in the world is not the evil we can see coming. It is the ordinary man in the ordinary house on the ordinary street that gives no warning at all.